I hope you've had time to recover from the previous video about Hisashi Aochi, because today's case is one I simply couldn't ignore. Once again, I have to warn you, if you're sensitive to horrifically unjust and terrifying stories about people, it's better not to watch this video. For those who are staying, welcome back to my channel, where we occasionally explore real crimes and strange phenomena. If you're into this kind of content, hit subscribe, and let's dive into today's story. Let me introduce you to a girl named Junko Furuta. She was described as a model teenager. She didn't smoke or drink, did well in school, and worked part-time as a waitress after classes. Junko was well liked at school thanks to her pleasant personality and hard-working nature. She lived in Misato. Misato is a small town near Tokyo, just a 30-minute ride from the popular Shibuya district. Now let me introduce you to a guy named Nobuharu Minato. He lived even closer to Tokyo, just 15 minutes away. Minato was the polar opposite of Junko. He was a local troublemaker who often hung out with his friends in one of Misato's parks. According to media reports, their favorite pastime was harassing random girls. His friend Hiroshi Miyano, a classmate of Furuta's, had a crush on her, but didn't expect anything to come of it. She never responded to his advances, and unlike some of her classmates, she wasn't impressed when she found out he supposedly had ties to the Yakuza. In fact, it scared her. On November 25, 1988, the young man saw her in the park and egged Nobuharu and two other friends on to take revenge on her for rejecting him. Junko had ridden her bike through that park many times before it was her usual route from work back home. The boys, recognizing her, put their premeditated plan into action. Nobuharu Minato shoved Furuta as she rode past. She fell to the ground, and at that moment, Hiroshi coincidentally walked up and helped her up. Minato had already slipped away, but Hiroshi decided to see the act through. He chivalrously offered to walk her home, and she let him, even though she was completely shaken. Soon you'll realize this was a fatal mistake. Instead of taking her home, Hiroshi took Furuta to an abandoned warehouse. Once inside, Miyano threatened to kill Junko and her entire family if she made a sound. He tried intimidating her again with his Yakuza connections, then raped her. Afterward, the boy and the traumatized Junko returned to the park where Nobuharu Minato was waiting. There, they told her they knew where she lived. In Japan, students' addresses are listed in notebooks they're required to carry, and they warned her that if she resisted, the Yakuza would come after her family. Unable to fight back under the weight of their threats, she went with the boys to Nobuharu's house, where she was subjected to a group you-know-what. Knowing her family would panic if she disappeared, the boys took precautions. They forced her to call her parents and say she had run away to stay with a friend. The terrified girl complied not once, but 3 times. From late November to mid-December, Minato's parents initially suspected nothing. Their son explained that Furuta was his girlfriend and would now be visiting often. In reality, things were very different. Furuta wasn't just visiting, she was being held captive in the Minato household. For the next month and a half, the parents' fear of the Yakuza kept them from intervening. Imagine this: Nobuharu had terrified not only the kidnapped girl, but also his own mother and father with his mafia claims, so they chose to turn a blind eye. For 44 days, Junko Furuta endured a living hell. She was repeatedly, "You know what hell mean?" Sometimes by one person, sometimes by groups. At first, it was just Nobuharu and his friends, but soon other men they knew joined in. Up to 12 people came every day. The rapists showed photos and videos to their acquaintances, but no one tried to stop them. The torture was brutal. Junko was hung from the ceiling in Minato's room and beaten like a punching bag. They fed her only small amounts of food, mostly milk, alcohol, water, and live cockroaches. And much more that I can't say. YouTube would never allow this. At some point, the girl began literally rotting alive, which made the boys lose interest in her. One of the first people to report what was happening in the Minato household was a witness stitch. You know what I mean. Hiroshi had invited him over for fun, and when the boy saw what was going on in that room, he went home and told his brother, who then told their parents, who in turn reported it to the police. The officers didn't ignore the tip. They went to the Minato residence. This could have been the end of it, but no. Nobuharu's parents assured them there was no girl in their house and that the suspicions were mistaken. The police found their story convincing and left. They didn't even conduct a cursory search, even though the owners invited them inside to check for themselves. The second attempt to speak up came from Junko herself. She miraculously escaped the room and called the police. But she never got to speak to anyone. The boys noticed her and dragged her back. When the police called back, Hiroshi Miyano answered. Once again, he convinced the officers that nothing was wrong, and the call had been a mistake. For trying to escape, the abusers doused Junko's legs in lighter fluid. For 44 days, no one intervened. The Minato family was too afraid of the mafia. By then, Junko's parents had already filed a missing person report, but the police's efforts were far from effective. The boys' loss of sexual interest in Junko didn't mean their lust had faded entirely. During the 44 days, Furuto was held captive. The teens committed at least one more. Threatening her with a knife and the Yakuza, they shoved the victim into one of their cars and took her to a motel. Freeing Furuta was never an option. As they later admitted during the investigation, they were afraid of getting caught. Junko understood her hopeless situation, but had no way to escape call for help or defend herself. She was constantly under threat and surveillance. On January 4, 1989, one of the boys, enraged after losing money in a game of mahjong, viciously attacked her to vent his anger. With that, her suffering finally ended. Afterward, the rapists decided to cover their tracks. They her in blankets, stuffed her into a suitcase, and debated what to do next. They settled on sealing her in a metal drum filled with concrete. At first, they planned to dump it in the ocean. But on the way, they changed their minds and left it on a vacant lot near a construction site. At the time, they were sure they'd get away with it. 2 weeks passed, and it seemed like the incident hadn't affected the teenagers at all. They acted as if those 44 days of torture never happened. Everything changed when Hiroshi Miyano and Joe Ogura were arrested on suspicion. You know what I mean. At the police station, Hiroshi overheard officers discussing an unsolved murder case. Assuming it was about Junko Furuta, which it wasn't, Miyano announced he'd confess and show them where the body was. In doing so, he incriminated himself and all his friends. Had it not been for this coincidence, Furuta might have remained a missing person forever, her never found, inside a 660-pound concrete-filled drum. At the time, in Japan, legal adulthood began at 20. Since none of the perpetrators were even 18, yet they were all tried as juveniles, resulting in shockingly light sentences, 4 to 17 years. Some speculate these lenient verdicts were due to Yakuza influence. Additionally, the court ordered Nobuharu Minato's family, whose home had been the site of these atrocities, to pay $45,000 in compensation. To cover this, the Minatos had to sell their house. But Junko's family never saw that money. Everything from the sale went to their son's friends after they got out of prison, likely again because of his alleged Yakuza ties. As for the other perpetrators' parents, the creepiest part is that not all of them felt guilty. Hiroshi Miyano's mother, whose son was still in prison while his friends were gradually released, actually believed, let this sink in, that the victim, Junko Furuta, was to blame for her son's downfall. She even tried to desecrate Junko's grave. After his release, Hiroshi changed his name to Nakayama, deepened his Yakuza ties, and took up kickboxing. In 2013, he came close to going back to prison, and since then nothing has been heard of him except that he makes a living through financial scams and drives a BMW. In 2018, Nobuharu Minato was arrested again. After his release, he changed his name to Shinji, but his new identity didn't change him. According to police reports, the then unemployed 45-year-old Minato assaulted a random man. Joe Ogura, released in 1999, also showed his true colors like Minato and Miyano. For example, he attacked a waitress at a Tokyo restaurant and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The only one who seems to have genuinely reformed is Yasushi Watanabe. After prison, he lives with his mother. At the very least, he hasn't made headlines for any crimes. As you can see, almost none of these monsters, it's hard to even call them anything else, change. All except Watanabe went on to commit petty or serious crimes, as if prison had no effect on them. I also want to mention how Junko is remembered. Throughout this video, clips from a movie about this case were shown. The film is terrible, but even worse, someone once made a manga about this incident. That manga is disgusting. The author clearly deranged, sexualized Junko herself, and the horrors she endured. I don't even have words to comment on it. Thank you all for watching.